Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got a ton of material here about cybersecurity, specifically focusing on the New York Department of Financial Services Cybersecurity Regulation. We're going to unpack, what's important, why it matters, and what stands out to us.
You know, it's interesting. This regulation, while it's focused on New York, has the potential to really set a cybersecurity standard worldwide.
Yeah, it's like New York's kind of setting the bar, huh?
Yeah.
We've got some great sources to help us with this. Excerpts from NYDFSregulation.com and then a couple of YouTube videos that you sent over.
Right. Sounds good.
Let's get into it.
All right. So the regulation, or 23 NYCRR 500 as it's formally known, aims to protect consumer data and financial systems from cyber threats. It applies to, a pretty wide range of organizations. You've got your banks, insurance companies, really anyone operating in that New York financial space.
Okay, so pretty high-stakes stuff. Sounds pretty comprehensive.
Very much so. The regulation covers 12 key areas.
12 key areas. So we're not just talking about having a strong password, are we? What are some of the things that stand out to you?
Well, one of the things that I find interesting is the focus on proactive measures. Things like risk assessments, penetration testing. It's not just about reacting to incidents, it's about trying to prevent them in the first place.
Yeah, because a single data breach could be devastating. Right. Not to mention the impact on consumers.
Exactly. And the regulation, it goes beyond just those technical safeguards. It also emphasizes things like employee training, the oversight of third-party vendors, and of course, having a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, to kind of oversee everything.
I was just going to ask about that. So having a CISO is not just best practice, it's actually mandated by the regulation.
That's right. It really highlights how seriously New York is taking cybersecurity in this sector. Now, you mentioned some YouTube videos that caught your eye. I think those were focused on privileged access management, PAM, and then also Multi-Factor Authentication, MFA.
Yes. Those two really jumped out at me. We all know MFA is becoming pretty standard these days. I mean, I use it for everything. But PAM, that's something I haven't thought much about. What's the big deal with PAM?
So PAM is all about controlling who has access to your most sensitive systems and data. The things that could really cause some damage if they fell into the wrong hands. Think of it like the keys to the kingdom. You need very, very tight controls.
Okay, so that's like the extra layer of security for those super critical accounts.
Exactly. And the NYDFS regulation, it has some very specific requirements around PAM, establishing an inventory of those privileged accounts, applying the principle of least privilege.
Hang on, least privilege. What does that mean?
Basically, users should only have access to the information and systems that they absolutely need for their job function. No more, no less.
So don't give everyone admin rights just because it's easier, right? Okay, that makes sense. But even with PAM, couldn't someone still slip through the cracks?
That is where MFA comes in. Multi-factor authentication is like double locking your door. Even if someone steals a password, they're still going to need that second factor of authentication, like a code from your phone or a fingerprint scan to actually get in. And that is why the NYDFS regulation mandates MFA for any access to those sensitive systems.
I use MFA all the time, but I never really thought about it as a regulatory requirement. It's fascinating to me that these are specific requirements, right, for MFA and PAM. It's not, just a suggestion, it's the rules.
Right, and that has implications not just for those companies in New York, but potentially for the entire cybersecurity landscape.
I'm curious about that. What kind of global impact could this have?
Well, New York is obviously a major financial hub. By setting a high bar, they're influencing how other jurisdictions approach cybersecurity. Companies that operate globally, they'll likely just adopt these practices in other regions, even if it's not mandatory, just for consistency and risk reduction.
So it's like a ripple effect starting in New York and then moving outward.
Precisely. And as more companies do this, it raises the bar for everyone, leading to hopefully a more secure digital environment overall.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've got this regulation in New York, potentially impacting global cybersecurity, all because of protecting consumer data and financial systems. What's interesting is that this could actually impact me and you, even if we don't live in New York.
Absolutely.
It's all connected.
It is, and that's, I think, a really important takeaway for our listeners. This might seem very specific to finance in New York, but it has implications for all of us.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that cybersecurity is something that we all need to be thinking about taking seriously.
Right, but I have to admit, I'm starting to get a little lost in the all the technical details. Can you give us some real-world examples of what these requirements, particularly around PAM and MFA, might look like in practice?
Absolutely. Let's imagine a scenario. Let's say you work at a big bank here in New York City. You're responsible for processing wire transfers. Now, under this regulation, your access to that wire transfer system, that's considered a privileged account.
Oh, okay.
So you wouldn't just log in with a username and password. You'd also need to use a second factor of authentication, like a one-time code from an app on your phone. That's MFA in action.
Right.
And on top of that, your activity would be monitored very closely. Like the system's tracking every transaction you make, every file you access, even how long you're spending on certain tasks. That's an example of PAM.
So it's not just about making it harder to log in. It's about keeping an eye on what those users are doing once they are in.
Exactly. The goal is to prevent unauthorized access and to detect any suspicious activity as quickly as possible.
Right. Because even with all the safeguards, there's always a chance that someone could, slip through.
Yeah.
So you need that layered approach,
Right.
both preventative and detective.
Absolutely. And this actually ties back to what we were discussing earlier about the global impact of this regulation. As more companies adopt these practices, it creates a safer environment for everyone, not just those in the financial industry.
Okay. I'm starting to get the bigger picture here. But are there any downsides to all this regulation?
That's a great question. I mean, while the goal is obviously to improve cybersecurity, it does come with certain, challenges. Some would say it's overly burdensome, especially for smaller institutions that maybe don't have the resources to implement everything. Others worry about unintended consequences, like companies becoming so focused on compliance that they neglect other aspects of cybersecurity.
So it's like checking all the boxes, but maybe missing the bigger picture.
Right. And it's crucial to remember that compliance is only one part of a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. You've got to go beyond just meeting the minimum requirements, proactively identify and mitigate risks.
That makes sense. Now let's go back to those 12 key items covered by the regulation. We've talked about PAM and MFA. What are some of the other areas that are covered?
So we talked about having a CISO, but the regulation also mandates things like creating a formal cybersecurity program, doing regular risk assessments, implementing strong access controls. You've got identity management systems, and even encrypting sensitive data, both when it's stored and when it's being transmitted.
Okay, so it really is a holistic approach, covering everything from technology to policies and procedures.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of security within the organization, everyone understanding their role in protecting sensitive information.
And it's not just about protecting the organization itself, but also its customers and the wider financial system. So if I'm just a consumer, I'm just an average person who uses online banking, shops online, how does this regulation impact me?
That's another great question. I mean, the goal here is to protect consumers like you from data breaches and cyber attacks. By making these institutions implement strong cybersecurity measures, it makes it a lot harder for criminals to, steal your information, access your account.
Okay, so it's like an extra layer of protection, even though I might not even realize it's there.
Exactly. It's about creating a safer and more secure digital environment for everyone. But even with these safeguards in place, it's also important for individuals to, take their own precautions, strong passwords, be wary of phishing emails, keep your software updated, things like that.
It's a shared responsibility, right?
Yeah.
Companies do their part. Individuals do their part.
Absolutely. Now, one aspect of the regulation I find particularly interesting is that requirement for penetration testing and vulnerability assessments.
Oh, those sound intense. What exactly are they?
So penetration testing is basically a controlled attack on your systems. Ethical hackers, they try to find those vulnerabilities that could be exploited by actual attackers. It's a way to really test your defenses, see where you're weak before someone else finds them.
Oh, so it's like a fire drill for your cybersecurity.
Exactly. Vulnerability assessments are, they're more like automated scans, I guess you could say, looking for those vulnerabilities in software, systems, things like that. It's all about finding and fixing weak points before they can be used against you.
So it's a combo, right? Proactive and reactive measures. Trying to prevent, but making sure you're ready if something does happen.
Right. And the NYDFS regulation, it mandates these tests pretty regularly, really emphasizing how cybersecurity is an ongoing thing.
Yeah, it's a continuous process, always adapting to whatever new threats are out there.
Precisely. The threat landscape changes constantly, and regulations and security practices need to evolve with them. That's why the NYDFS regulation stresses staying up to date. Organizations need to be checking the NYDFS website, subscribing to those industry newsletters, just to stay informed about any changes or updates.
So it's not like set it and forget it.
Definitely not. Cybersecurity is, it's ongoing, requires constant vigilance and adaptation. This is a great transition into a deeper dive into those specific requirements for PAM and MFA.
All right, let's dive into those specifics about PAM and MFA. We've talked about the concepts, but what does it actually look like in practice?
Well, when it comes to PAM, the regulation really gets into the weeds. It's not just saying control privileged access. It's saying, here's how you need to control it.
Okay, so real specifics.
Real specifics. And one of the key things they emphasize is that principle of least privilege we keep coming back to. You need to know who has access, but then also actively limit it. Only what's absolutely necessary for their job.
Right, so no more just giving everyone admin rights because it's easier.
Exactly. And it's not just a one-time thing. They want you to regularly review those accounts, make sure those permissions are still appropriate.
Makes sense. So people's roles change, their access should change too.
Right. And it's not just about who has access, it's about what they do with it. That's where the monitoring and logging come in. The NYDFS wants companies to track all that privileged activity very closely.
So like if somebody goes rogue, you have a record of what they did.
Exactly. It's crucial for investigations, incident response. You can see what happened, who did it, and hopefully figure out how to prevent it from happening again.
Okay, so with PAM, you're basically trying to minimize the damage that a bad actor could do, even if they do get in.
That's a good way to put it. Now let's shift to MFA. The source material really stressed this idea of using multiple factors from different categories.
You know, I use MFA all the time, but I've never really thought about those categories.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean?
Think of it this way. If you're using, let's say, 2 passwords, that's 2 factors, but they're from the same category, right? Something you know. But if you use a password and a fingerprint, that's something you know and something you are. Much more secure.
Ah, okay, so it's not just about the number of factors, it's about the types of factors you're using.
Exactly. And the NYDFS regulation is pretty strict about this. They don't want companies cutting corners, they want real security.
No security theater.
Right. And they're not just focused on the technical side of it, they also talk about making sure MFA is scalable, flexible, it needs to work for a lot of different users and situations, and it can't be so complicated that people just give up on it.
Yeah, you've got to balance that security with, actually making it usable.
Exactly. And the source material talked about how important it is to monitor those MFA systems, look for any weird activity, be ready to respond quickly if something's wrong.
So it's like you've got to have someone watching the security cameras at all times, just in case.
That's a great way to think about it. And all of this really reinforces that cybersecurity is not a one-and-done thing.
It's a journey.
A journey. And these regulations, they're kind of like a roadmap. They give you some direction.
And we talked about how New York's kind of leading the way here. Other states, even other countries, are paying attention.
Yeah, it's pretty influential. And what's great is that it's raising the bar for everyone, which ultimately benefits everyone, right?
Absolutely. So big picture, what do you want our listeners to take away from all this?
Cybersecurity is everybody's responsibility. We all have a role to play in making the digital world safer.
Well said. And, resources like this regulation and this discussion are a good place to start learning more, right?
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. Thank you for sharing your insights with us. I feel like our listeners have learned a lot today.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, stay safe out there, be aware, and stay informed.
Excellent advice. To all our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it valuable and informative. Stay secure.